Welcome everybody that's joining us for our last session, our closing keynote. As you've done before, please do use the chat to introduce yourselves, where you're joining us from, and we'll get going in a couple of minutes when the virtual room has filled up. Great to have people from all over, not just over the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, but from elsewhere in Europe, a few people in North America. Just going to give it another moment or two before we get started, but please do continue to use the chat just to introduce yourselves as we wait. Okay, well, welcome. Really good to have you here with us. Thank you. I know there's some of you that have been with us ever since Thursday evening, and Ed Damiano, and there's been other people joining through the course of the weekend. I know people in Scotland in particular who have survived Storm Aidan. People in England who are looking forward to lockdown 2 next week. So. But it's been a great weekend, and welcome to our closing keynote. I'm just going to explain how this next hour or so is going to run, and then before I hand over to other people. So I'm Chris. I'm just going to do the introductions here. Please do continue to use the chat. I think everybody is getting comfortable with how these webinars run, but please use the chat to introduce yourselves. When we come to our main talk in a moment, please use it to comment, to converse with one another. Really appreciate how everyone has kept the chat respectful throughout the weekend. Please continue to do that right to the end. And then next to the chat box, you'll see a Q&A box. So when we come to for our speaker Kyle a little bit later, if you've got questions, please do fill up the Q&A box, and I'll be able to put those to him on your behalf. So consistently, both through the chat and on social media and elsewhere and in the hallways, we want to appreciate the great feedback that you've given for the conference. We want to thank again our sponsors for putting this together, allowing us to put this together. But the conference would not happen had it not been for the incredible hard work of our 3 trustees of T1 Today UK, who worked for many months to make this happen over this weekend. And I want to hand the floor over to each of them in turn to say a few words as we close our conference. And first of all, Gwen Sutherland. Gwen, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Well, what a different conference this has been, but nevertheless, it's been just as much fun as our usual in-person ones, although we have all missed the hugs. However, it wouldn't have taken place without all the hard work put in by a number of people, but I must give a special mention to Glyn Robinson. Ash, Douglas and I were not very tech savvy. Well, to be honest, and Douglas in my case, not at all tech savvy, and Glenn saved the day. Glyn has worked tirelessly since April, when we knew we had to move from in-person to virtual, and it has paid off. What Glyn has produced is, to my mind, absolutely mind-boggling. So Glyn, on behalf of the trustees, staff, tech support, this year's faculty, and the 795 delegates, thank you. And now I'll pass to Ash.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and very well said. I'd like to express a huge thank you to you and to Douglas for working so hard behind the scenes for so many weeks to make sure this virtual Friends for Life could happen. I'd also like to salute Glyn and his tech team, especially Laura Braid, who is perhaps the most talented multitasker I've had the privilege to work with, power cut or no power cut. Our brilliant room captains, led by Chris, Emma and Ellie, they've kept us all in line, helped us field questions, and they've made everything run on time. Incredible. I'd like to thank all the techies from LifeScan for their support for all of our sessions. We thank you, our incredible faculty who have shared their time and their knowledge so freely, all of our speakers, just a remarkable group. Especially our friends from across the pond who have had to get up at some odd times to be with us. Ed Damiano, Jill Weisberg, and Carl Rose, who you're going to hear from us once we've stopped waffling on. We're grateful to all of these speakers. They share all of their knowledge and their time free of charge, and we really appreciate it. Our staff, many of whom have been with us for our real life conferences and have adapted and delivered and come up through the ranks as children or joined as parents. Our youth leaders, Alex, Laura, Chelsea and Neil have just been outstanding. T1 today is about care today, cure tomorrow. Our conference tries to blend hope for the future with living in the now. And I think we managed to do that this week. And I think speaking to some of you in the hallways, I think we've managed to get that through. I've watched all your children meet and laugh and have fun. I've met so many of you in the pub. We know it's not the same as meeting in person, but it's as close to the hug that we all need as we can get in a virtual, socially distanced world. So with sincere thanks again to my fellow trustees, I'd like to hand you over to Douglas.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to say just a very brief few thank yous. First of all, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us. And we, on behalf of all the trustees and all of our volunteers and faculty, we really hope that you've enjoyed these last 3.5 days and hope it's been informative, productive and useful. And indeed you have made some friends for life. And of course, we're really looking forward to hopefully getting back to in person next year, certainly as soon as we can. Some other thanks, definitely want to echo what both Gwen and Ash have just mentioned. Glyn, thank you for all your amazing IT input, absolutely fantastic. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. Gwen, for all your absolutely tireless work that you carry out right throughout the year, a huge thank you on behalf of everyone here. Ash, also your amazing input for this virtual conference and your energy, which has been so evident for I mean, all the sessions you've been involved with and the hallways, people can see that. A huge thank you for that. Finally, a huge thank you to our sponsors. Really, we're ever so grateful for your support. Beta Bionics, Insulet, Abbott, LifeScan, a huge thank you from us all. Again, we really hope to see you again next year and all being well, that will be in Glasgow. We very much look forward to seeing you there. And without further ado, I shall hand back to Chris for the final keynote speaking session. Thank you.
Thanks, Douglas, Ash, Gwen. So let's get on with our last session. We've got a really interesting final keynote for you, something different, which is good. So something which is different, I think, from all the other sessions we've had so far. And we are really privileged. It's a great pleasure to have Kyle Rose come and speak to us. Kyle was a professional cyclist with Team Type 1, a cycling team which a number of you will have heard about and read about over the years. And he's made a transition from the bike to somebody who really makes a difference to the type 1 community, someone who is passionate about the patient voice and also about progress and in areas like digital health, and a leader amongst our community. He is founder and managing director of Digital PM Diabetes, the initiative which perhaps he's best known for is the My Sugar app, and I'm sure he'll be sharing a little bit about that. And that leadership role has been cemented with his recent appointment as Vice President of the International Diabetes Federation. So we're really pleased to have Carl come speak to us. Please do put your questions for him in the Q&A box. Carl, thank you for joining us on a Sunday, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you to Douglas and Gwen and all the organizers for inviting me to come speak today. I'll jump right into my PowerPoint presentation with technology permitting. All right. So first of all, I'd just like to just share some disclosures with organizations and projects that I currently have influences and engagements with, and jump right into a little bit about who I am. As you may have gathered either from the name or my description and bio, I'm a bit of an international mix. And the two places I've spent most of my time in my life happen to be on two different sides of the pond. So my base for me on the European side is in Aix-les-Bains, France, the foothills of the French Alps, best known for perhaps the '92 Winter Olympics in Albertville, or amazing cycling country, which was no coincidence with my background. I got to watch the Tour de France go right in front of my doorstep a few times with my with guys like Greg LeMond riding when I was younger, and got a real interest in the sport back then. Also known for some of the stinkiest cheeses and loveliest cheeses in France. On the flip side, on this side of the Atlantic, where I'm speaking to you from today, I'm from Moscow, Idaho, a small town in potato country. So Idaho is famous for a number of things, including Yellowstone National Park and famous potatoes. It's even written on the license plate. But perhaps more relevant to this audience, I share something with all of you. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 16. In fact, I was living in Idaho at the time. And probably similar to many of you also, I would imagine, I developed a long list of symptoms. It took several months for the healthcare professionals here to identify what was going on. And by the time they did, I had everything that you would know, from incredible thirst to frequent urination and dehydration to the point where I was cramping up, and muscles and the balls of my feet and strange places because my body was struggling for hydration so much. And it was actually my eye doctor in the end who suggested that I get tested for diabetes, because he said, listen, Kyle, your vision has changed so drastically, so quickly, that you really need to get checked for diabetes. And sure enough, he was correct. I was fortunate enough to get all that vision back once insulin had been reintroduced into my system. But it was quite the scare, as you all know. And I wasn't in DKA, I was borderline. I was over 800 milligrams per deciliter, so over 45 millimoles. And I entered the stage of my life where, or a number of stages in my life in terms of how I was handling that diabetes diagnosis, which took several years for me, including my first year at university. And that included, frustration, very much the why me? Why do I have to be going through this? To denial, to the realization that this was something I needed to be educated about so that I could handle it the best, the best possible. And this realization that insulin was now something I needed to have on me and available, and the dependence where I would really have no vacation, which was frightening. Even if I wanted to take a night off, it wouldn't, my body wouldn't necessarily follow suit. And I learned that the hard way a few nights out at uni. But I think I was very lucky in the sense that I had a group around me, whether it was the healthcare team or more so my family and teachers and so forth in high school, that really encouraged me to keep on doing what I was doing. And that included sports very much. Sports was a big part of my life already. And that, I think, allowed me to mature in a way, diabetes, it's a type 1 diagnosis. You mature in a way that's not natural perhaps for your age, and an enormous responsibility you take on. I was motivated to take care of my blood sugars in a big way. And it wasn't only because of the recommendations from the healthcare team, which I certainly acknowledged in terms of avoiding other potential complications, but it was also that I just felt so much better when I was in range. And that was both true on the bike and in the athletic world, as well as academically, and how I felt in general. But often I'm asked, if I were to go back to 16-year-old Kyle, what I would say in terms of advice with my years of wisdom. And actually this last bullet point is definitely what I've come up with in terms of that answer, that I was such a numbers person, and I still am to some degree, that when I heard I needed to be in between these ranges of blood glucose measurements, it felt very much as a failure to me whenever I wasn't, which was, as we know with diabetes, pretty frequently on that diabetes roller coaster. And I wish I could have understood that there wasn't going to be such thing as a perfect day or a perfect week or even a perfect few hours, and that it was all right if there was going to be a little bit of up and down. And that realization, I think, happened a few years later, but I think it was an incredibly important one for me. And as I mentioned, I was fortunate to have people around me that encouraged me. Now, don't get me wrong, I had my days where I met well-intended people who had a fair amount of ignorance about diabetes. And I think, of course, we've all encountered that. And that included people in the academic establishment as well as otherwise that didn't understand what I needed to be successful. But for the most part, and especially in the athletic world, I had people who were encouraging me and trying to provide me with whatever tools and help they could to make me successful. And one team in particular, as was mentioned in the introduction, that I met rather early on in its development was Team Type 1. And this was a group currently under the name of Team Novo Nordisk, you may know it as, that was doing athletic events ranging from criteriums to triathlons to endurance events, and had a body of knowledge that I just couldn't find anywhere else at the time relating to doing sport and diabetes. And this is a picture in the very early days of Team Type 1. You'll see, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. This is me in the center here, standing next to Phil Sutherland and Joe Eldridge, the co-founders. But what was remarkable was this was a group, this was our training camp that had come together. I think you see both Team Type 1 and Team Type 2 represented here, doing a number of very challenging events and managing our diabetes all the while. And this was my profile at the time, and my apologies go to my father and British family here, as I was only allowed 2 nationalities on the official sports card, so the Union Jack didn't make the cut. But this was what I looked like when I had a little bit more hair and was in my cycling shape, along with a few diabetes details you see on the right there. The point that I wanted to talk about with Team Type 1 was it was a real transition for me to begin to understand how sport could be a platform to tell a story and a message about people with diabetes. And I think that, when you're, certainly when I was that age and when you're focusing on success, whether it be a sport or otherwise, it was hard for me to really think about that overall picture of advocacy, which since then I've really focused on. So I have a video that's essentially kind of a montage of some of these pieces of advocacy I did at the national and international level, and I'll play that now.
Bonjour, I am Kyle Jacques Rose. I am living in Aix-les-Bains, France, which is the foothills of the Alps, the French Alps. And my story is that I've been living with type 1 diabetes since I was a teenager. I live by a motto, and it's really important to me when it comes to my type 1 diabetes, and that's that à diabétique, rien d'impossible. Nothing is impossible with diabetes. I am somebody who is very involved in the world of sports. I always have been, and was already doing sports at the high level before I was diagnosed. Around the clock, nighttime races, criteriums, endurance races, all these things are things I've been able to do, and it's just been a question of figuring out how I can best maintain good blood sugars during that time. There's no vacation from diabetes.
And the reason it was adapted to music in the later portion was a lot of those interviews were in French. So whether it was with L'Équipe, a well-known sports media outlet, both digital and radio and TV, or it also included some of my sections with the nightly news in France. I can remember, I think it was TF1, so arguably BBC equivalent. But thanks to the training that I had received at some of the events through Team Type 1, I really learned a lot about how to tell my story about diabetes before and after the race. And interestingly, I think I developed a skill for it where it wasn't only about the race result. And thank goodness for me, because I wasn't always winning my races. But when I was even coming in somewhere in the middle of the peloton, I was getting interviews. People were hearing about my story, competing with diabetes and the various devices I was wearing to help me in terms of my diabetes management, and educated a lot of people about what that meant. And that was incredibly important to me at the time. So here are some additional examples. I think what was so contagious about that environment, being surrounded by the T1D community, as it was at Team Type 1, as it is at places like this conference, is that there's this intense passion that we feel where we're really emotionally connected to people living with diabetes and what that means and the struggles that can be part of that day to day. And Team Type 1 took the approach. We really wanted to use the bike as the platform to show that despite having diabetes, that we could thrive, as well as have fun. And equally important part of the mission was going to community events, whether they be diabetes youth camps or otherwise, and share that with people, as you can see in this picture here. And I'm often quoted now since then, having worked with a number of diabetes and sports organizations, that it seems like we sometimes forget about sports as the piece of diabetes therapy. What I mean by that is we have insulin and medication, of course. We have, blood glucose management and nutrition, but sometimes we forget this third pillar. And I think that it's something that is too often overlooked. And I really have emphasized in that, I guess, for lack of a better term, in my development as an advocate, encouraging people to try what can be otherwise quite daunting, and for good reason, right? As people living with type 1, there's a fear, impending fear of hypoglycemia. And when you're doing diabetes in sports, and I know there's a number of other people in this conference who have spoken on that topic. Gavin Griffiths has actually become a good friend thanks to Douglas, because we met at a conference Douglas was organizing a number of years ago. And I think that all of us are frequently asked, well, how do I do it? What's the magic list, the ingredients for me to go out and start doing sport? I know I should be doing, I want to be doing it, but I'm scared. And that's fair enough. And I think, unfortunately, the answer I've come up with is, like with many things with diabetes, it depends. It very much depends on the individual. And so there's not specifics that would work for everybody. And I've come up with a list of factors that are important to consider and ranges that work for me as an individual. And the first on that list is intensity and fitness level. And I would actually notice a increase in insulin over the course of a cycling season to the tune of about 20%, meaning that not that I was necessarily out of shape, but I was in much better shape come beginning of the spring, and my insulin needs changed as a result. So that level of fitness combined with the intensity and duration of the exercise were very important factors for me to consider for each race. And intensity, of course, can also mean how challenging the actual sport is. Is it something that you've done before? Or in my case, is there going to be climbs involved? I'm not the strongest climber. My fellow cyclists will tell you I was more set up in terms of shape to be a sprinter. And so those climbs took a lot more energy. And this was the range in terms of units of measurement. So you have milligrams per deciliter on the left, millimoles on the right, and it looks pretty tight. It looks like a pretty tight range. But what I would tell you along to that information to complement it is that it was something I was doing more than 25 hours a week, either on the bike or training. So, thus a big percentage of my life was being spent doing sports. And as a result, I really narrowed in on my target ranges. Didn't mean I was always there, but that's what I was shooting for. I would say that if you're doing sports less frequently, then of course it would make sense perhaps working with your healthcare team to find that target. Maybe it's a little bit higher in order to avoid potential hypoglycemia. But out of all the factors that were influencing my blood glucose management during exercise, active insulin, which is why it's in red, was the most influential, and also discussed or referred to as insulin on board. As you know, this refers to how much insulin in the last bolus, if you're using a pump, or injection, if you're not, are still active in your system. And for me, that meant that if I was an hour and a half post-injection or bolus, I'd taken it an hour and a half ago, and I was in the middle of my ride and I just saw the biggest mountain I'd ever seen I was about to climb, I knew the combination of those two factors, needing to expend that energy and my insulin peaking, was something I needed to address through nutrition, through glucose, whether it was Lucozade, sports drinks, whatever it may be. And the combination of those was most influential. And I developed a rather sophisticated and complex approach to my basal rates and nutrition intake, which I discuss in a publication. Anyone who might be interested, I worked together with Dr. Miles Fisher out of NHS Scotland to publish that a number of years ago. And I think one of my future slides will discuss it. But I can't emphasize enough that my success was also a factor of of how much the people around me were helping. And this slide, which some of you may have seen me present before, speaks about that rather symbolically. Every year, my good friends and I try to do a climb or a summit of over 10,000 feet, 4,000 meters, roughly. The picture on the left shows my three good buddies that have known me all my life, before and after my diabetes diagnosis. And we were going up a beautiful mountain in the top part of California called Mount Shasta, right on the Oregon border. What you can't tell from that picture is that it was an incredibly cold and windy day. And we did what was called an alpine summit. So we camped the night at, I think, around 10,000 feet and started on our summit around 3 a.m. the next day. And the wind was blowing and it was cold. And so my meters and blood glucose measurements were just not working, whether it was not having enough blood or the technology itself just wasn't quite happy with the surrounding temperature. And so what we did was, and this is easier to show when I'm on stage, but the three of them would crowd around me and I would put my hand inside my backpack and I would take my blood glucose measurement on every hour, hour and a half, something like that, as we were going up this challenging summit. And for me, it was very symbolic in the sense that these were my type 3 entourage. We hear about spouses, family members, coaches, teachers, anybody who falls into that lives and helps us with our diabetes through us, the people living with diabetes. And these were my strong type 3 supporting cast. And they would have told you that hourly break was for Kyle's blood sugar check. But I think that they were actually quite content to take a break every so often going up that steep hill. So I was okay with that. And I continued the tradition in a few other places, including the Andes in South America. That was, I think, the highest I've ever been at 5,800 meters in Bolivia. You can see I had captured a blood glucose measurement. I think I discussed that in the session with the children, that I got to the top, and what did I want to do? I wanted to take a picture of my blood glucose meter. How funny our minds work, those of us living with diabetes. And on the upper right, you'll see, of course, right near Mont Blanc, l'Aiguille de Midi. As a result of the types of groups I was involved with, post Team Type 1 as well, I continued to be involved, encouraging people to do sport. And of course, the bike was always a favorite to me. This Mobile Health Grand Tour was an event that took place at least twice that I was an ambassador for. And I think Gavin actually may have participated in it one year. I participated in a few stages, and over 45 people in this group were living with type 1 and participated in the entire journey from Brussels to Barcelona. And then we did it again a few years later from Brussels to Geneva, of course, taking some breaks along the way. This is a group that I couldn't say enough about, the Randonnée Cycliste du Diabète. The average age of these guys and gals is about 70 years old. They've been living with type 1 for many, many years and have a lot to say about it. And they invited me one year to go on along with them. And what they do is there's a French Diabetes Congress that takes place yearly. This was pre-COVID. And what they would do is they would travel from the year it was the beforehand. So let's say it was in Paris one year, and then this current year it was going to be in Lyon. Then they would do Paris-Lyon over a few days. And what's just wild about this is the amazing attitude these folks have. And their motto was "A diabétique, rien d'impossible," that you saw in the video that I've adopted, and I proudly wear their jersey. I think they're a wonderful example for all of us in the community. And they have a lot of funny stories too. Gisèle Lafont was someone else I teamed up with. Now, this was not on the bike. She was a former high-level athletics runner from France, and she had become very involved in assisting youth to with different chronic diseases to go up Mont Blanc. And this was one where we actually traversed the Alps from the Rhône-Alpes-Grenoble area all the way down to Monaco. I wasn't there for the entirety of that, but it was a pretty amazing trip, and different members, local members of the diabetes community would follow us for certain parts of the journey. And here you see Leon, who's standing next to me on my right, carrying his flag from his local diabetes association. It was a wonderful event. And we ended up in the Prince's Palace of Monaco with an invitation to a banquet. I don't think the prince made it himself, but it was certainly a first for me. So through sport, I was really kind of developing a set of skills that I never really anticipated. Because as a person that I was formally trained in engineering, my full-time job was as an engineer. And so that's what I studied at university. And very soon after, I had a first project that was for a medical device manufacturer in diabetes, and totally fell in love with it. Selfishly so, really, because I felt like I knew a lot about the day-to-day experience and wanted to be able to impact it from a technology perspective. So you see on the left, my geekiness wasn't so much in front of the computer. I was a chemical engineer by training and working a lot on some of the blood glucose sensing at a junior level at first, of course. And on the right, my writing slowly grew in level, where I was being sponsored by competitive organizations and teams, as well as nonprofit collaborations with folks like American Diabetes Association, JDRF, Fédération Française des Diabétiques, and ultimately IDF. As was mentioned in the introduction, after I received my MBA, I founded a division of Delta Project Management called Delta Diabetes, and that allowed me to actually focus all of my work, as well as my team's work, on diabetes-related projects. And some of those projects included startup companies that I'll address later in the presentation. TheraSense, I was very much a junior engineer when I worked there. Abbott actually acquired that company, and a lot of the guts of what we were working on was put into the Freestyle Libre, which I'm sure you know. Diabeloop is a hybrid closed loop company. I was on the board for a while out of Grenoble in France, doing similar work to what Ed Damiano's fantastic group is doing at Beta Bionics. So I think that when I look back 10, 15 years now, we've come a long ways in the industry. We have a number of patient influencers like Ed, who have a very personal connection clearly to living with diabetes, that are working on these products, which wasn't so much the case when I first started doing the work with Delta Diabetes. And a lot of our projects were focused on exactly that, to raise the PWD voice, to talk about user experiences, the practical, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it meant to live with diabetes. So in parallel, I had developed advocacy skills through sport, understanding the nonprofit world's motivation to advocate for diabetes, whether it be diabetes policy at the government level, or access to devices and supplies and medicines through national insurers. NHS, for example, Sécurité Sociale, CEPAM in France, or in the United States with commercial insurers. And my role today in a lot of these companies is as an advisor or an investor, very much focused on this mission-inspired and patient-led initiatives. I never would have thought that this diabetes diagnosis would have allowed me to travel the world. And I ended up speaking, whether it was at TED or the Houses of Parliament in London and Brussels, places I never thought I would have a chance to even visit, let alone be invited to speak about my diabetes experience. These organizations that I was working with were interested in having me tell the story. And I traveled to over 50 countries, believe it or not, whether it was for a race, an event, or maybe my race or event was somewhere near then, or I was training. For example, I lived in Singapore for a while, and I was able to travel across that Southeast Asia region. And I would often do that to explore. Diabetes certainly never stopped me in those travels and adventures. So it was mentioned in the introduction, and I mentioned it again on my slide on career tracks, and My Sugar was a team of fellow diabetes geeks, I would say, that I met around the 2012 era. At the time, it was a group of 4 or 5 German, Austrian, Swedish guys hanging out in an office in Vienna. And what really struck me about this group was it wasn't so much the advertisement that we used to see of the perfect blood glucose on the meter, which always frustrated me. It was always like just too good. I was like, I just want to see it on a different number. And I think some of the meter companies have since changed that, of course. But it was about, this is the reality of living with diabetes. Sometimes it sucks. And we as a company want to try to make that less, or as a startup company. It's hard to call us a company back then when we were so small. And these guys, whether it's Frank Westerman or Frederick DeBong, some names you might recognize, wanted to do this via digital products that helped connect other devices, whether it was blood glucose meters, insulin pumps, what have you. But they did so in a way that really resonated with me. And I think that the community needed to hear that this was a diagnosis that can turn our lives upside down. And that certainly as adults, we're living with it on our own most of the time. I mean, the healthcare professional is there and is there for a short time usually. And the rest of the time, it's this thing called self-management, which can be incredibly challenging. So I just have a video from iSugar to show you a little bit of a taste of our communication and the way we thought about things. It talks about a type 2 patient, but I think it's relevant.
Now, according to your blood tests, I'm very sorry to tell you that you have type 2 diabetes. Now that is significantly above. Tame your monster.
So illustrating diabetes as a monster was somewhat controversial at the time, because we did have people come back to us and say, hey, you know, I don't consider it a monster, but I think to be fair, it is. And we thought of it more as a Monsters University type monster, which was scary at first, for sure. But as we learned to maybe manage it and figure out some of the details, that it was less scary and it was something we could tame. And the idea, I think, that we could communicate in a way that felt natural and that sometimes wasn't so fun, resonated with the big community. And before we knew it, we had millions of users of the software and app products. This is a picture of me next to the fellow T1Ds. You'll see Scott Johnson next to me, who's involved with the CWD Orlando conference. You may know him just behind me. And then Frank Westerman, the CEO. These were people that became very close friends over the years. And just maybe as a update on that, the company was sold to Roche a few years ago. So we're delighted that these products and services continue to be distributed to fellow T1Ds around the world. So that kind of brings me to current day. Through the journey I took, I've been very fortunate to be invited to participate in roles such as my recent appointment on the board of directors at the International Diabetes Federation. I also have a number of other projects that I'll go through briefly. One of them is the Diabetes Wise Project at Stanford School of Medicine, which is funded by Helmsley Charitable Trust. Pan-European project, which is part of the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Inodia, working on an immunological solution to diabetes and delaying the onset of type 1 diabetes. And then some of the previous ones that I mentioned. What was, I think, pretty exciting to me as my career developed was that there were a number of people that were publishing, important people that were publishing articles that came towards me, a person living with diabetes, to include my point of view. And I think this was particularly exciting to me as perhaps the son of two teachers. I didn't have a PhD behind my name, but the fact that, professors and diabetologists and academics were coming towards me and asking me to contribute in their important writings and manuscripts felt satisfying, because I think it was a view that perhaps their fellow healthcare professionals and academics and professionals weren't being as exposed to. And this publication on the left was the one I was referring to. I wrote along with Miles Fisher a number of years ago about my training regimen. On the right, this was a clinical trial I participated with Dr. Eric Renard on the hybrid closed loop system that he was working on. And this was years ago before it was available, and look at how much progress we've made. So that's just really exciting to see. And even places like the Lancet, where I was most recently published, have began to pay more attention, I would say, to this PWD perspective, which is so sorely needed. Oh, and while I'm on this, I happen to have a family member who was very much in an advisor role, or two family members, I should say, my aunt and uncle, Sally and Bernie, if you're watching. Thanks for all the advice on the publications. Now, this organization was called Life for a Child. It is still today. It was part of IDF back then. You may be aware of it. If you're not, I would encourage you to take a look. They help children with diabetes who don't have access to insulin and testing supplies in developing countries and poorer countries have access. As we know, living with type 1, it's really, for our survival, something we need. And so otherwise it would be a devastating case. And I had the opportunity to visit Bolivia, a center in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and help with some awareness and fundraising for that particular group, which for me was enlightening, in the sense that I had never really realized to what degree this disparity of access existed and how unfair it was for these poor children. Flipping gears to Diabetes Wise. So Helmsley Charitable Trust funds this project. It's US focused for the most part today, but I think it's relevant content. And what the project strives to do is help people identify which devices could be useful. So you go on to the platform, which is primarily a website. You enter in, these are my wishes and desires. These are perhaps the things I struggle with diabetes management. And so forth. And there's an algorithm that actually spits back up a recommendation. This combination of devices, a blood glucose meter and a smart insulin pen, or a CGM and a pump, etc., or some combination that fits what could be your needs. Then it links to testimonials that are videos or articles from people living with diabetes who have tried those devices. Some of them have stayed with them, and they talk about their experience, from the frustrating stuff to the stuff that worked. And so I would encourage you to take a look. We're always looking for feedback. It's in English. While it is primarily US focused, I think a lot of the content is relevant. And the goal is to increase awareness of devices and ultimately access to those folks who may not have heard of some of this technology. And Corey Hood leads that project at Stanford University. Inodia is a project that is funded by the EU Commission, and it is to the tune of tens of millions of euros, I should say. It is very much involving the UK, which is probably worth mentioning today. A lot of those, I think, relationships maybe were pre-Brexit, but have managed to stay very much involved in the project. Thank goodness, because the work being done from David Dunger at Cambridge University and his team is instrumental in the research that's taking place. But one of the reasons I wanted to highlight it was both David Dunger, Dr. Dunger, and Dr. Chantal Mathieu out of Brussels have taken an approach which I find somewhat unusual to clinical research. Excuse me. It doesn't look like my animation is working. There we go. That the Patient Advisory Committee is at the center of the project. So European projects that are funded by the EU Commission have work packages with different parts of the project. This is typically how they're structured. Every single work package is going through the Patient Advisory Committee, and they're looking for advice from us, the scientists, the doctors, on how to communicate about the work that they're doing, which, quite frankly, should be the case. We know what is going on with the day-to-day diabetes experience. And they may, from a clinical perspective, taking nothing away from it, but they may not know how to communicate those in non-scientific ways. And so whether it's recruitment or just touching on sensitive issues as it relates to diabetes, it's been wonderful to work with this team. And I think we're seeing more and more evidence of this across the diabetes space. These are my fellow Patient Advisory Committee members. And in the lower left there, you'll see Javier Paul from the UK, from Birmingham. The last project I'd like to speak to you about today is a project that's near and dear to my heart. I was involved in this first in 2012 when I was invited to come speak at the IDF Youth Leadership Camp as a speaker, similar to my presence today. And I totally fell in love with what they were doing. And it was the gentleman in the upper right here wearing the tie, João Nabais, the former IDF Europe president, who recruited me to become more and more involved as the years went on. And it was easy for me because there was a big element of the camp that was actually sports. And it wasn't necessarily competitive sports, although we spoke about the importance of sports and physical activity in diabetes treatment. It was also about team building and creating young leaders. And thanks to the amazing efforts of IDF Europe, this initiative has grown from year to year. People like Christina Petrut from Romania and Irina Vlasenko from the Ukraine and Elisabeth Dupont, who's the regional manager, have allowed this camp to really blossom and bring in delegates from all across the region, being hosted across the region as well, from Slovenia to Italy, Croatia. And in 2015, Bas van der Goor hosted us in Holland. You may have heard of Bas. He's a former gold medalist in volleyball, living with type 1 diabetes. And you can't miss the guy if you ever see him at a conference, particularly if he's standing next to me, because he's about 6'8" or 9. He towers above me and is quite a character. So he's one of the people that has hosted this, his organization, I should say, in Holland that year. The purpose of this camp very much being to create young leaders with diabetes and empower them to talk about our needs with diabetes and work together as a community across borders. Croatia in 2018, and then last year in Turkey. This year there's an online version going, and it's 18 to 25, I think it might even be 18 to 30-year-olds now. If you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look at the website or contact me. We're always looking for good people to participate. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I wanted to make sure and leave time for questions. 2020 has been a tough year for a lot of different reasons. But we found a reason to smile, and I've shared a lot of firsts with you throughout this presentation. First, the time I did this in my career, first time I did that. Well, this year I have a first as well, and please meet Aaron Henry, who's taken a nibble out of my glucometer in that picture. Aaron Henry was born in February, and he has brought us a lot of smiles during 2020. I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions during the remainder of the session.
Hey, thank you, Carl. you covered a lot of ground there. So I know you're used to a long distance cycle ride, but that was a presentation which covered an awful lot of ground. So thank you. There's a few questions I've managed to pick up from the chat as people have gone on. If you've got any more folks, that please do add them in the Q&A box. Interested in obviously you talked about kind of two periods in your life, the one as a pro cyclist and the one since as as an advocate and an entrepreneur. What is it in terms of your own personal care for your own type 1 that you've been able to take from that sports career into your life since kind of stopping being a pro cyclist?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that when you're doing sport as much as I was during that time, you become kind of oriented, at least guided, to be a finely tuned machine, and you pick up on subtleties that maybe I wouldn't have picked up otherwise. So in terms of my own diabetes management, I've maintained sport as an important part of my regimen. And it's not 25 hours a week anymore, particularly not since Aaron was born. I'm lucky to get away for a few hours here and there on the bike, but it's still, nevertheless, my family understands how important it is for me to continue that. And I think it's a point that I bring to other organizations. In the example of My Sugar, this was a digital application looking at devices, and the sports aspect of it wasn't as much being considered. That was one of the reasons they were interested in having me involved. And so finding a way, particularly as we have more complex devices, whether it's watches or wearables, to be able to capture that information about sport and perhaps bring it to the same place so we can use it as part of our measurements and diabetes therapy.
Great, thank you. A question about patient voice. So I guess the world that we live in now is really quite different from even the one when you were starting out with My Sugar, and in terms of kind of the digital environment, access to social media, and anything you'd like to say, advice for people who are keen to get kind of a patient voice in our digital social media world today?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think particularly because I don't consider myself a social media expert. And I think I've been fortunate in the organizations I've worked with to have very strong social media advocates. But one of the things that's clearly changed is that social media has become such an important channel. And I think that people are out there and listening, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, whatever your platform is. One of my good friends and former colleagues, Scott Johnson, is a blogger in the United States who's followed by thousands and thousands of people. And his advice to me always was, it's intimidating, but just put your message out there. And as you begin to connect and talk about your diabetes story, this amazing power of the online, diabetes online community, which is no stranger to your conference and to other CWD events, kind of has this domino effect. And I think what's wonderful about that, particularly having been diagnosed in a rural area, is that it allows people to tap into the power of the community, even if perhaps people aren't nearby. And I guess that couldn't be even more true, than as we're living right now through this COVID era. And it's nice to have some interaction.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from a parent back to kind of the sports area. So, and this is a comment I've heard a number of times through the conference. So people with younger kids, I mean, you mentioned about the age at which you were diagnosed. Obviously, we've got a number of parents of people who've been were diagnosed at much younger ages and struggle with barriers to participation in sport, whether that be at school or in clubs. People saying you can't do that with type 1, or the environment in which sport is organized being very difficult for people with type 1 to make the adjustments that are needed. Any advice that you've got for kind of breaking into sport for people that are finding that tricky, particularly at a younger age?
I think it's a very valid and real concern, certainly one that I experienced myself, whether it was in the classroom and the accommodations I may need, or to be able to have food or a meter or something with me during an exam, or during, physical PE education, right? Physical activity education at school. I think that it's intimidating, particularly when it's a new diagnosis, but I think it's important to be your own advocate, because there are needs that you have, and certainly rights that you have for your child to participate in these events if your child would like to. And I think that some teachers and institutions are more accommodating than others, and clearly there are some cultural aspects of that as well. But I definitely had to have my own fights from time to time with some university professors about what I was entitled to. And I think that it's satisfying now to see organizations addressing that head on. And I'm sure that, the organizers of this conference could point whoever asked that question maybe to some more local resources. But one example is in the United States, the College Diabetes Network, which really intends to establish chapters led by student advocates to make sure that students at university have a comfortable environment, again, no matter what that class or activity may be. And I think that applies to young kids as well, although I'm not as experienced in that area.
Great, thank you. We're kind of bumping up against our time, but I've got two more questions I'd like to ask you, if that's okay. Really good. So I know that in this conference we've had a really vibrant teenage community and also a group of young adults that have been meeting. If we've got younger people that want to get involved in patient advocacy, want their voice to be heard, how could they get started? What's a good first step for someone that wants to share their experience? What would be a good first step for them to make?
Yeah, and of course, I think my answer probably has changed since February of this year, because I would say do your best to get together, and together we're more powerful as a community. Together, we speak loud in a louder voice. But I think, again, through online, and this is a great example, what has been done with this conference, but to be able to do this virtually, to meet people, whether it was at the inn or a session, and you made a connection with someone who lives with diabetes, whether they're in your area or not, I would encourage people to reach out to fellow PWDs that may have a similar story or may not, because together your voices will be stronger. And whether it's an organization like this one, or International Diabetes Federation, or Diabetes UK, these associations are looking for young people. It's not always obvious from the literature on the websites, and sometimes it feels like it's not addressing our needs as type 1s. I would add that comment. But I think that certainly, having worked with some of these organizations now, most recently as a board member at IDF, they are really interested in having young people involved and want to hear your story, want to hear how they can change what they're doing to help you out. Again, whether it's Diabetes UK, JDRF UK, IDF, I would encourage you to reach out to them, and I think you'll find receptive folks. And if they aren't, then go off and do your own thing, and they'll love you for it nevertheless, because we need to have a community that's representative across all ages, and our needs are different if we're 12 compared to me now, well into my 40s.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that's great advice, which is going to help some people get started. Last question. It really struck me watching your slideshow and your presentation, the number of photographs you had of you in groups of other people. I mean, I bet if we went back through the whole slideshow, there would be probably thousands of people that you were stuck in the middle of photos with, and in many cases people that were all type 1, right? I mean, not all of them, but many of them. What is it for you about being around a group of like-minded people? It seems to me that you kind of gravitate towards teams of people and teams of like-minded people. What is it about that which has really made a difference for you?
I think it goes back to that slide I had on the type 3 entourage, whether it's people that are in our families, whether it's people at In my case, a lot of times it was coaches on teams. I think that the reason perhaps it's so important to me personally is when I was a teenager, I was reluctant to share this. I was in a competitive sport. I didn't want to appear weak. That was really what I was thinking. And with the wisdom I have now, a few years later, I think I wish I could have just been more open to sharing that. And that was a hard thing to do as a teenager. That is a hard thing to do. But I think if you do, you'll be surprised at how many people are receptive and want to help. And again, I know that may change culturally depending on where you're from and the people you're around. But for the most part, for the many countries I've visited and the different organizations I've worked with, people really want to help. And they may not understand it completely in that type 3 entourage. They may drive you nuts, but they are often very well intended. And that is only amplified when they're fellow type 1s because they get it. And together we can help each other and we can be incredibly strong. And cycling is an interesting sport when you think about it as it relates to a group, because it's an incredibly independent sport. You're out there on your bike on your own. But those of you who may know some of the intricacies of cycling, certainly on events like Tour de France or Vuelta going on right now, España, you're actually working together with a team, and people have different roles on the team. So for example, for me, I was a lead out sprinter. My role on the team was to bring out the sprinter behind me. It was not a very gloriful role in the sense that my goal was to spend all my energy so that I could position the guy behind me to be in a good position to finish and sprint and win the race. And together as a team, that's how we work. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons also that being around a strong team has been so important to me.
Thank you. That's a great picture to leave us with, Carl. Really appreciate you giving up some of your time on a Sunday. And it strikes me that we've all of us have been to conferences where we hear talks by kind of inspirational people about their own life story, and we've all been to conferences where we hear talks which kind of educate us on developments in the type 1 community. And I think one of the unique things about your perspective is that you bring both. So you bring your own inspirational story from Team Type 1 and the organizations you've been involved with since then, but you do so as, you know, as an advocate and as such an educated advocate, you know, for us all. So really appreciate your unique perspective and the time that you've given, and you know, taking time to answer questions as well. Thank you for closing our conference in such a great way. To everybody else who's online, really appreciate you joining us since Thursday. I know that we that have been involved in running the conference have just had a great time, and I hope you have as well. We look forward to seeing you in person. We really hope it'll be in person in Glasgow around this time next year. Look out for more details. The videos and the presentations. Watch out for emails as to when they're going to be made available for the sessions that you missed. And then one last thing, if we were in person at a hotel in Glasgow, what we'd be doing now is we'd be saying our goodbyes and catching up with sharing contact details in the hotel lobby. We can't do that online, but what I can do is ask you, once you log off this call, to head back into the meeting space in the conference, in the virtual conference venue. That will be open for a while for us to say our goodbyes and see you next year's online as well. But for Kyle and on behalf of Gwen and Ash and Douglas, can I say thank you to everybody, and we'll see you in Glasgow next year. Bye now.